The Kansas plains stretched wide and silent in 1872, a place where the wind carried secrets and distance swallowed sound. Along that endless road stood a small inn called the Dalton Rest, its crooked sign swinging in the dry breeze. Travelers came here for warmth, a bowl of stew, and a sip of whiskey to cut the cold. From a distance, it looked like safety. Up close, it felt like waiting. Inside, two brothers ran the place, Amos and Elijah Dalton. Amos moved quietly, his eyes soft but hollow, his hands always folded, as if in prayer. Elijah was his opposite, quick with a smile that never touched his eyes, always asking questions that seemed harmless until they weren't. Together they made an odd pair, one gentle in faith, the other loud in charm, both bound by something no one could name. At night, the inn glowed like a lantern in the middle of nowhere, drawing riders and drifters off the empty road. Some stayed for a meal, others for the night, their horses tied to the post outside, steam rising from their breath. But not everyone left by morning. Some rooms stayed empty too long, the sheets stripped, the names forgotten. Locals started to notice the pattern. Men heading west, who never reached the next town. Merchants whose wagons were found days later, with no driver, only the faint scent of whiskey soaked into the wood. When asked, Amos would say the land swallowed the lost. Elijah would laugh and pour another drink, telling stories about bad weather and worse luck. Still, there was something strange about that place, something no one wanted to admit out loud. The air around it always felt too still, too heavy. Travelers passing by swore they saw lanterns burning in the windows long after midnight, shadows moving like they had nowhere to go. Some said the brothers were blessed, others said cursed, but everyone agreed on one thing: the Dalton Rest stood where the world felt thinner, where kindness could hide cruelty just beneath its smile. Those who stayed there remembered the silence most of all, the way it pressed against the walls, how the floorboards creaked like whispers. And as the years went on, the stories grew darker. The missing faces became a list, the kind preachers prayed over but never spoke of by name. The inn remained open, its doors wide, its hearth burning. Yet something inside it changed. Some said the brothers looked younger, like time had slowed for them while the rest of the world aged and moved on. The stagecoaches no longer stopped. The road turned quiet again, and the Dalton Rest became a dot on maps no one trusted. Travelers still came, drawn by the promise of rest, but the question hung in every room, floating between each sip of whiskey and every candle flicker in the dark. How many souls had crossed that threshold, and how many had never left? When the government surveyor went missing, the prairie went still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. His name was Joseph Harlan, a man known for his maps and his steady horse. He was last seen riding toward the Dalton Rest, promising to return within a week. But only the horse came back, its reins torn, its eyes wide with something close to terror. The saddle was slick with a dark stain that wouldn't wash off. Sheriff Willard didn't believe in curses or campfire tales. He was a man of logic, not fear. Still, something about the Dalton brothers unsettled him. Their calmness, their quiet way of answering questions before they were asked. When the sheriff arrived at the inn, Elijah greeted him with a smile that didn't falter, even when Willard dismounted with his hand on his revolver. Amos stood behind the bar, polishing a glass, murmuring a prayer under his breath. The smell of whiskey filled the air, sweet, sharp, and wrong somehow, as if something rotten had been hidden beneath the scent. Behind the inn, the earth was soft, recently disturbed. The sheriff's men dug until shovels struck bone. One grave, then another, then another. The bodies were buried shallow, their pockets empty, their throats stained black as though burned from the inside. Amos claimed they were wanderers who had fallen ill, that he and his brother had given them mercy and burial. But when Willard lifted a flask found near one of the graves, he caught the faint smell of almonds, the mark of poison. Word spread fast. The Dalton Rest became a name whispered over fences and in churchyards. Travelers avoided the road, and those who had once called the brothers kind now crossed themselves when speaking their names. Yet the brothers never ran. They stayed, serving drinks to the few who dared stop by, answering questions with the same serene calm. When authorities searched the basement, they found barrels stacked to the ceiling. Some were filled with whiskey. Others, when pried open, revealed fragments of bone floating in thick amber liquid. In the far corner of that basement was a pit, wide and deep, lined with ribs and skulls packed like stones. Amos knelt beside it, whispering the same prayer over and over. We served them what they wanted. Elijah only smiled, saying the men they buried had begged for it, that they'd come seeking redemption in liquid form. We didn't kill them, he said softly. We helped them leave what was already dying inside. The sheriff's men hauled them out into the light, their faces calm, their hands bound. The brothers didn't fight, didn't curse, didn't weep. They only looked back at the inn as though it were still speaking to them. That night, when the sheriff wrote his report, he stopped more than once, his pen trembling. He wrote the facts: graves, poison, bones, but couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen lingered there, something breathing in the dark. By morning, the Dalton Rest stood empty. The wind moved through its halls like a sigh, and beneath the floorboards, in the cold earth that held its secrets, something shifted, as if not all the men who went missing were ready to stay buried. The winter that followed was long and unforgiving. Snow buried the Dalton Rest, sealing its windows and muffling the world around it. Most believed the horror was over. The brothers were gone, the dead were buried again, and the land would forget in time. But the land never forgets. Months later, when the thaw began, a railway worker repairing old tracks a mile from the inn struck something with his shovel. It wasn't stone or wood. It was glass. Inside the bottle floated a shriveled finger, pale and distorted, preserved in an amber liquid that caught the sun like fire. On the label, written in a steady hand, was a name, Samuel Pike, and a date that matched the day he vanished from town. The worker dropped it and ran. When authorities came, they found dozens more buried along the tracks, half hidden in the frost. Curiosity led them back to the Dalton Rest. The inn stood quiet, leaning slightly to one side, as though tired of keeping its secrets. Inside, the air was thick, with the faint smell of whiskey and decay. The tables were still set, dust covering plates that had not been touched since the arrests. Behind the bar, drawers were filled with small glass jars, each containing something that once belonged to a human body: an eye, a tooth, a lock of hair, each labeled carefully with initials, dates, and short prayers written on torn scraps of hymn book pages. Down in the cellar they found what looked like a distillery. Rows of barrels filled the room, some still sealed, others leaking a dark syrup that stained the floor. The whiskey inside shimmered faintly, its color richer than anything natural. When one of the men pried open a cask, the smell hit them first, sweet, metallic and wrong. Floating within the liquid were bits of bone, small and worn smooth as if handled many times. In Elijah Dalton's old journal, found near the furnace, investigators read his explanation. He called the bottles offerings of remembrance, tokens meant to preserve the essence of the lost. In whiskey, he wrote, a man becomes eternal. His sorrow dissolves, his sins sweeten. Each jar, he claimed, held a piece of salvation. The line between business and belief had vanished long before their capture. What began as theft and murder had become something else entirely, something ritualistic. They had stopped serving whiskey for coin. They had started serving it for souls. When the cellar was emptied and the bottles taken away as evidence, one remained unclaimed, resting in the shadows behind the furnace. Inside, the liquid glowed faintly, and for a moment it seemed to pulse, as if the whiskey itself still breathed. The courthouse smelled of dust, sweat, and whiskey. It was the summer of 1874, and people came from miles away to see the Dalton brothers face judgment. Wagons lined the square, their horses tied to posts while families huddled in the heat, waiting for the doors to open. Newspapers had named them the Kansas Butchers, and every soul in town wanted to look the killers in the eye. When the brothers were led in, silence fell. Amos walked with his head bowed, his hands clasped like a preacher before prayer. Elijah followed, calm and smiling, as if he had been invited to give a sermon rather than stand for his life. The courtroom was packed, shoulder to shoulder. At the front, the prosecutor's table gleamed with glass, rows of bottles pulled from the Dalton Rest. Each one held its own horror, its own name etched into the label. The faint smell of whiskey clung to the air, but beneath it was something rancid, something that made jurors swallow hard and glance away. When Amos looked up and saw the bottles, he began to whisper softly to himself, a prayer no one could quite hear. Elijah stared straight ahead, eyes bright, lips curved in a faint smile. Witness after witness took the stand. A merchant described the night he stayed at the inn, the strange aftertaste in his drink, the dreamlike fog that followed, the sound of something heavy dragging beneath the floorboards. A woman spoke of her brother who'd gone missing, of how Amos had written to her afterward, claiming her brother had found peace through the bottle. Each story bled into the next, until fact and nightmare became one. The crowd leaned forward, half in horror, half in awe, trying to understand how faith could twist so far from mercy. When Amos finally spoke, he said he had seen visions, angels with faces made of fire, whispering that sin had to be burned clean, that whiskey was the Lord's vessel for salvation. "I only followed the will of heaven," he told the judge. His voice shook, but not from guilt. It was conviction. Elijah, when questioned, smiled as though humoring a child. He spoke not of faith but of science, of how the human body could be preserved, its essence kept alive through a sacred mixture of spirit and blood. He called it alchemy, he called it redemption, he called it love. The prosecutor called it madness. He held up one of the bottles before the jury and asked if any man could drink salvation from the remains of another. The question hung heavy, unanswered. Behind him, the sheriff stood pale and silent, clutching his hat in trembling hands. When the verdict came, the brothers stood together as the judge spoke the words, "Death by hanging." Amos closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer. Elijah nodded once, almost approvingly, as if the sentence itself completed the experiment. Outside, the crowd erupted, not with cheers but with murmurs, confusion, tears. Some said justice had been done. Others weren't sure justice even existed for something so strange, so far beyond human understanding. The brothers were led away through the back door, their chains clinking softly like the toll of a distant bell. In the days that followed, the town grew quiet again, though no one truly rested. People kept their distance from whiskey, from prayer, from the dark corners of their own hearts. Because as the gallows were built on the hill, one question kept echoing in every home, every church, every sleepless night. If the Dalton brothers were monsters, why did they look so much like the rest of us? The night before the hanging, the air in the jail was still and heavy, thick with the kind of silence that feels like prayer. Amos Dalton sat on the edge of his cot, whispering hymns to the cracks in the stone wall. Elijah stood by the barred window, watching the lanterns flicker in the courtyard, his reflection ghosted against the glass. The guards kept their distance. No one wanted to be too close to the brothers who had turned whiskey into something darker, something holy in their own minds. As midnight neared, Amos asked the warden for a final request, a drink of their own making. Elijah smiled when he heard the words, as though he'd known the moment would come. The warden hesitated, but curiosity has its own kind of pull. From the evidence room came a single bottle, sealed in wax, labeled with the initials AED. The whiskey inside shimmered faintly in the lantern light, thick and golden like honey. When the bottle was opened, a strange scent rose into the air, sweet and metallic, with an undertone of earth, like rain falling on blood. 2 glasses were poured. Amos bowed his head, whispering a blessing only his brother could hear. Elijah raised his glass high and said, "To the body, the spirit, and what lies between." They drank in perfect unison, the sound of the swallow echoing faintly against the stone. For a long moment, they simply sat there, eyes locked, the corners of their mouths curling into faint smiles. A guard swore later that he saw the color drain from their faces, not with fear, but with a kind of peace, as if they were finally crossing into something they'd been waiting for. When dawn came, the gallows stood ready. The sheriff opened the cell and stopped cold. The brothers were hanging from the rafters, side by side, their hands still bound, their faces calm and pale. Their skin gleamed faintly under the early light, as though varnished. A faint scent of whiskey lingered in the room, thick and unnatural. The doctor who examined the bodies found traces of the same chemical mixture that had been discovered in their barrels, part whiskey, part blood, part something unknown. Rumors spread fast. Some said they had poisoned themselves to escape the rope. Others whispered that the brothers had done exactly what they'd promised, preserved themselves beyond death, sealing their souls inside the last bottle they shared. When the warden ordered all evidence destroyed, the sheriff buried the remaining casks deep beyond the fields, under the frost, swearing they'd never be unearthed again. But time has a way of loosening secrets. A few months later, one of the grave diggers who helped with the burial vanished. His shovel was found near the site, the earth freshly turned, the scent of whiskey faint in the wind. At night, locals claimed to hear voices by the hills, soft, murmuring, like a toast repeated through the soil. They said the Dalton brothers never truly died. They simply changed form, trading flesh for spirit, breath for amber. And somewhere deep beneath the ground, the last bottle still waits, the liquid inside glowing faintly, as if two hearts continue to beat within it. The bottle appeared without warning, tucked inside a crate of Civil War memorabilia bought at an estate auction in 1979. The Kansas antique dealer, Harold Merrin, thought little of it at first. It was small, sealed in thick glass, its wax faded to a dull brown. The label was fragile but legible, E.D. 1874. When he turned it under the shop light, something inside shifted. The liquid caught the glow like fire, and in its center floated a pale fragment that looked almost human. He assumed it was a trick of age, some chemical reaction between whiskey and air. But when he placed his hand on the bottle, he swore he felt something, a pulse, faint and rhythmic, like the slow beating of a heart. Curiosity overpowered caution. Harold sent the bottle to a local university for testing. The results confused everyone. The liquid showed traces of ethanol and blood, yet the tissue inside had not decayed, not a cell out of place after more than a century. Under certain light, the substance vibrated, almost imperceptibly, as though responding to sound. One researcher joked that it was alive. None of them laughed. Harold brought it back to his shop, locking it in a glass case by the counter. Within days, strange things began to happen. The clocks in the store stopped at the same hour every night, 12:17. Customers complained about whispers, a soft clinking sound like glasses toasting somewhere in the walls. Harold's assistant, a young man named David, became obsessed with the bottle. He said he could hear it humming when the lights were off, that it called to him when he was alone. Harold dismissed it as nerves until the night the boy disappeared. The security footage was grainy but clear enough. David entered the shop after closing, took the bottle from its case, and sat on the floor with it. For several minutes he simply stared, then, slowly, he pried off the wax seal. The camera caught the moment he lifted it to his lips. He drank. Seconds later, his body convulsed, his head snapping back as though struck by lightning. The bottle slipped from his hand, yet not a drop spilled. His body went still, his eyes open and glassy, fixed on nothing. When police arrived the next morning, the shop was locked from the inside. David was gone. Only his jacket remained, folded neatly on the floor beside the empty display case. The tape was taken by investigators, but rumors spread through the town. Days later, a fire consumed the building. Witnesses swore they saw the flames burn amber instead of orange, and inside the crackle of wood and glass came a faint sound. Two men laughing softly, toasting something unseen. Today, the site is an empty lot. No grass grows there, only dry soil that smells faintly of alcohol after rain. Locals say that if you stand there at dusk, you can taste sweetness on the wind, like whiskey on the tongue. They say Harold was never found, and that sometimes a dim light flickers beneath the earth, glowing through the cracks like something breathing. The Dalton Rest is gone, swallowed by time and ruin, but the bottle wasn't the last. Collectors whisper of others surfacing across the Midwest, each sealed, each humming faintly when touched. They call it the Dalton Spirit, a drink that never ages, a taste of something eternal. And some believe that when you open the right one, you don't just drink the whiskey, it drinks you. The ruins of the Dalton Rest sit at the edge of a forgotten road, swallowed by weeds and silence. What remains of the foundation is cracked and crooked, half sunk into the earth like a grave that was never properly filled. The locals don't come here anymore. They say the air feels different, thick and restless, carrying the faint scent of whiskey no matter the season. But every few years, someone returns, someone searching for proof, or maybe for permission to believe. Urban explorers came first, dragging cameras and recorders through the ruins at dusk. Their footage begins with laughter, nervous and forced, and ends in whispers. They claim to hear voices beneath their feet, soft, indistinct, like men speaking from under layers of soil. One voice was calm, another sharper, both rising and falling together as if in conversation. When they played the audio back later, the words were clearer. Pour it again. Their thermal cameras captured something even stranger. Two shapes, standing side by side in the cold, glowing faintly like bodies still holding heat. Scientists dismissed it at first, until soil samples taken from the site revealed traces of ethanol mixed with hemoglobin, the unmistakable presence of blood. It wasn't contamination. It was as if the ground itself had absorbed what the brothers left behind, every drop of their work still breathing through the dirt. When sunlight hits the area at just the right angle, the earth gleams faintly amber, like something sleeping just below the surface. What if the Daltons were never simply murderers? What if their true creation was something far more enduring? Their victims were buried, yes, but perhaps not in the way anyone understood. Their whiskey was more than a drink. It was a preservation, a translation of life into liquid form. What they made in those barrels might have been their attempt to capture what every man fears losing, the spark that separates the living from the gone. They called it redemption, but maybe it was imitation. Maybe it worked. Today, when researchers place sound equipment deep in the ruins, the recordings always return with the same low resonance, a slow rhythmic thump, like a heartbeat buried beneath the ground. Some dismiss it as machinery echoing through the earth. Others know better. They describe a warmth rising from the soil, like standing over something that remembers being alive. A few of the explorers who visited the site reported strange symptoms afterward, a metallic taste in their mouths, tremors in their hands, dreams filled with flickering light and laughter. One man claimed he woke in the night to find the scent of whiskey on his pillow, though he hadn't touched a drop in years. Another said he heard someone whisper his name through his own breath. Whatever the Daltons discovered, it was never destroyed. It changed shape. It seeped into the ground, into memory, into the air itself. The bottles may be gone, the inn long crumbled, but something remains, something patient. The sound of faint glass clinking still echoes through the weeds on quiet nights. Perhaps the whiskey was never meant to intoxicate, but to preserve, to carry a fragment of life beyond death. Perhaps every toast is a small resurrection. And as the camera fades on the ruins, one question lingers like smoke in the dark. When we drink to forget, what ancient memory might be drinking back?